The champagne glass nearly slipped from my trembling hand as my daughter's groom sneered at me in front of his well-dressed boss. "This is just her deadbeat father," he said with a cruel laugh, his voice dripping with contempt. The elegant ballroom seemed to freeze as his boss slowly turned toward me, recognition flickering across his face like lightning. What happened next would shatter this arrogant groom's world forever. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is where you are now. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the white marble floor as I adjusted my second-hand tie for the third time that evening. The Ritz-Carlton's grand ballroom stretched before me like a scene from a fairy tale, with towering columns wrapped in silk and flowers, tables dressed in the finest linens, and guests who looked like they'd stepped out of a society magazine. Jessica looked radiant in her flowing ivory gown, her smile bright enough to illuminate the entire space. 27 years old, my little girl had grown into a beautiful woman, and today was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. The happiness in her eyes made every sacrifice worthwhile. I stood at the edge of the celebration, feeling like an actor who'd wandered onto the wrong stage. My reflection in the polished marble beneath my feet showed a man out of place. Work-worn hands that no amount of scrubbing could make soft, shoulders slightly stooped from years of crawling under sinks and into tight spaces, wearing a suit that had been expensive once, but was now 3 seasons out of style. The other fathers here moved with the confidence that came from belonging, from knowing that their presence added to, rather than detracted from their children's social standing. The ballroom was packed with Derek's colleagues and friends, all of them dressed in designer suits and expensive dresses that probably cost more than I made in a month. I felt like an imposter in my thrift store jacket, the one I'd bought specifically for this occasion and had dry cleaned twice to make sure it looked presentable. My hands, no matter how much I scrubbed them, still bore the permanent stains of honest work. Calluses from years of gripping wrenches and screwdrivers. Small scars from countless repairs that had put food on our table and kept a roof over Jessica's head. Derek Matthews, my new son-in-law, stood beside her in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, his platinum watch catching the light as he gestured animatedly to a distinguished older man in an expensive suit. Everything about Derek screamed money, from his perfectly styled hair to his Italian leather shoes, from the way he held his champagne flute to the casual authority in his voice as he discussed quarterly projections and market trends. He worked as a marketing executive at some tech company, and he never let anyone forget it. His education at an Ivy League school, his corner office with a view, his ability to navigate conversations about stock options and corporate mergers, these were the badges of honor he wore like armor against anyone he deemed beneath his social station. The way he looked at me during family dinners, like I was something he'd scraped off his shoe, had become a familiar sting over the past 2 years. It wasn't just disapproval in his eyes, it was bewilderment, as if he couldn't understand how someone like Jessica, intelligent, beautiful, accomplished, could have emerged from someone like me. He'd perfected the art of the backhanded compliment, praising Jessica for rising above her circumstances in a way that made it clear what he thought those circumstances were. "Dad, come meet Derek's boss," Jessica called out, her voice bright with excitement. She reached for my calloused hand, her diamond engagement ring sparkling under the chandelier. The ring that Derek had made sure to mention cost more than most people's cars, purchased from some exclusive jeweler whose name I couldn't even pronounce. I smoothed down my jacket and walked over with what I hoped was a confident smile, though my stomach churned with the familiar anxiety I felt whenever I was thrust into Derek's world of corporate success and material wealth. The older man turned as we approached. Something flickered across his face, recognition perhaps, and suddenly I felt a chill of memory. His steel gray hair was perfectly styled, and his navy suit looked expensive, but it was his eyes that triggered something deep in my memory. James Harrison, Derek had mentioned his name earlier. CEO of Technova Solutions, and now that I looked at him properly, I realized why that name had seemed familiar. 15 years older, successful beyond measure. But those were the same eyes that had looked at me with desperation when his company was failing. The weight of his gaze made the air between us feel thick, charged with shared history neither of us had expected to encounter. "Mr. Harrison," Derek said with that practiced smile he'd perfected for networking events, "I'd like you to meet my new family." His voice took on a different tone as his gaze shifted to me, and I recognized the subtle shift that always preceded one of his cutting remarks. "This is just her deadbeat father, Brandon Stevens. Handyman, plumber, the usual blue-collar stuff." The words hit like a physical slap, reverberating through the space between us with the force of a thunderclap. The champagne glass trembled in my grip, and I felt the familiar burn of shame crawl up my neck like a living thing. Around us, conversations seemed to quiet as other guests turned to look, drawn by the subtle change in atmosphere that accompanies public humiliation. I could feel their eyes on me, assessing, judging, finding me wanting in my second-hand suit and working man's hands. James Harrison's eyes narrowed slightly, studying my face with an intensity that made me want to step backward. The recognition in his expression deepened, and I saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Suddenly, memories came flooding back. This was the man who had sat across from me 15 years ago, pleading for a solution that could save his struggling startup. The same intense gaze, though the desperation had been replaced by success and authority. "Deadbeat?" he repeated slowly, his voice carrying a weight that made Derek's confident smirk falter. "That's an interesting choice of words, Derek, particularly when you're talking about Brandon Stevens." Jessica shifted uncomfortably beside me, her grip on my arm loosening as if my presence had suddenly become a source of embarrassment rather than comfort. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the string quartet playing in the corner. "Maybe you should go check on the seating arrangements? Or maybe head home early? It's been a long day, and you must be tired." The words hit harder than Derek's insult, cutting through the layers of protective numbness I'd built up over the years. My own daughter, the little girl I'd raised alone after Maria died, was asking me to leave her wedding reception. The betrayal cut deeper than any blade, and I felt something inside my chest crack like thin ice under pressure. The room seemed to spin slightly, and I had to concentrate on breathing normally, on not letting the gathered crowd see how much those words had wounded me. My hand found the back of a nearby chair, knuckles white against the gold fabric as I struggled to maintain my composure. The orchestra's violin melody seemed to mock the silence that had fallen over our small circle, each note a reminder of the elegance I didn't belong to. James's eyes never left my face, and I could see the wheels turning behind his measured expression, as if he was solving a complex puzzle that only he could see. There was something in his gaze that made me uncomfortable, not the dismissive evaluation I was used to from Derek's colleagues, but something deeper, more intense. Recognition was dawning in his eyes, and I felt my own memories stirring. This wasn't just any CEO. This was James Harrison, the man who had sat across from me in a cramped office 15 years ago, when Technova was nothing more than a desperate startup hemorrhaging money. Derek, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension that was building like electricity before a storm, took a long sip of his champagne and straightened his shoulders like a peacock preening for an audience. His confidence seemed to grow with each passing moment, fed by what he perceived as a captive audience and an opportunity to demonstrate his superiority. I could see him mentally cataloging James's expensive suit, his authoritative bearing, his obvious wealth, and calculating how this moment could advance his own social standing. "You know, Mr. Harrison," Derek continued, his voice gaining confidence from what he mistook for captive attention, "some people just don't understand the importance of ambition, of building something meaningful with your life." His gaze flicked to my worn hands, then back to James with a conspiratorial smirk that made my stomach turn. The look was designed to create an alliance, to draw James into his worldview where success was measured solely by income and social status. I mean, Fixing toilets and unclogging drains isn't exactly what I'd call contributing to society, is it? It's honest work, I suppose, but hardly inspiring or intellectually challenging. The champagne flute in my hand developed a hairline crack under the pressure of my grip. I set it down on the nearest table before my emotions could shatter it completely, the small clink of glass against marble seeming unnaturally loud in the charged atmosphere. Jessica's face had gone pale, her eyes darting between Derek and me like she was watching a tennis match where she couldn't predict the winner and wasn't sure she wanted to. Her bouquet trembled in her other hand, white roses beginning to droop from her nervous grip. Around us, other wedding guests had begun to notice the tension. Conversation slowed as people picked up on the charged atmosphere, the way voices had dropped and body language had shifted. I could see phones beginning to appear in purses and jacket pockets, people sensing that something significant was happening. The social elite of Derek's circle, drawn by the magnetic pull of potential drama, began drifting closer to our corner of the ballroom. "Derek!" James's voice cut through the air like a blade, sharp and precise. "I think you might want to reconsider your choice of words." Around us, conversations began trailing off as curious faces turned our way, drawn by the magnetic pull of unfolding drama. The string quartet continued playing, but their music seemed distant now, a soundtrack to something that was rapidly spiraling beyond anyone's control. Derek's confident smile faltered for just a moment before returning, though I caught the slight twitch at the corner of his left eye, the first sign that his composure wasn't as solid as he pretended. "Oh, come on, sir," Derek laughed, but the sound came out forced, like air being squeezed from a punctured tire. "I'm just being honest here. Jessica deserves better than having to explain why her father shows up to events like this looking like he just crawled out from under a sink." He gestured at my jacket with a dismissive wave, and I felt heat rise in my throat like bile. "You should see him at family dinners. Grease under his fingernails, talking about fixing people's toilets like it's some noble calling. It's embarrassing, really. Jessica's learned to just manage the situation, haven't you, sweetheart?" The words cut deeper than any blade, slicing through the protective layers I'd built around my heart over the years. Derek was right. Jessica had learned to manage me. I'd seen it in the way she'd introduced me last at parties, hoping people wouldn't ask what I did for work. The way she'd changed the subject, when Derek made his cutting remarks about blue-collar limitations and knowing your place in the world. The way she'd grown quieter over the past year, her laughter becoming forced whenever Derek joked about her father being beneath their social circle. "Just last month," Derek continued, warming to his theme like a performer who'd found his rhythm, "he showed up to our engagement party straight from some plumbing job, reeking of drain cleaner and wearing those awful work boots. Jessica was mortified, absolutely mortified. Had to spend the whole evening making excuses, explaining to our friends that not everyone in her family had managed to make something of themselves." His voice grew crueler, more confident, feeding off what he perceived as a captive audience. "Honestly, Mr. Harrison, some people just don't understand that there are standards in polite society. Some people will always be exactly what they were born to be, nothing more, nothing less." Jessica's free hand moved to her temple, fingers pressing against her skin like she could push away the headache building behind her eyes. "Derek, please," she whispered, but her voice carried no real authority, no conviction. She looked at me with something that might have been pity, and that hurt worse than anything Derek had said. She'd been hearing these comments for months, watching Derek systematically tear down everything I was, and she'd chosen silence, chosen him. "Dad, really, maybe it would be better if you just—" She couldn't finish the sentence, but the words hung in the air like smoke, the same words she'd used when Derek suggested I shouldn't come to their engagement party. The same tone she'd taken when she'd asked me to park my truck around the corner so her friends wouldn't see it. The gathered crowd had grown larger now, drawn by the magnetic pull of witnessing someone's carefully constructed world begin to collapse. I could see phones appearing discreetly, recording what was clearly becoming a moment that would be replayed and dissected for years to come. Derek's confidence seemed to grow with his audience, his voice becoming louder, more theatrical, as if he was performing for their entertainment. James stepped closer to Derek, close enough that Derek had to tilt his head back to maintain eye contact. The movement was deliberate, calculated, like a chess master positioning his pieces for checkmate. "Tell me, Derek," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of absolute authority, "what exactly do you know about contribution? About sacrifice?" The words came out measured, each syllable precisely placed like pieces on a chessboard. Derek's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed, the first crack appearing in his arrogant facade like a fissure in a dam that was about to burst. I mean, Derek stammered, his practiced corporate confidence beginning to crumble under James's steady gaze. The platinum watch on his wrist caught the light as his hand trembled slightly, and beads of sweat had begun to form along his hairline, despite the perfectly climate-controlled ballroom. Jessica's grip on my arm had loosened completely now, her hand falling to her side as she stepped almost imperceptibly closer to her new husband, the distance she created feeling like a canyon opening between us. My fingertips found the smooth metal of my wedding ring, still worn on my left hand after all these years. The simple gold band had cost me 3 weeks of overtime at the engineering firm where I used to work, Technova Solutions, back when it was struggling to stay afloat, and James was just another desperate CEO looking for someone to save his company from the bankruptcy that seemed inevitable. Back then, their offices were in a converted warehouse on the wrong side of town, filled with second-hand furniture and the desperate energy of people who knew they were either going to revolutionize the tech industry or lose everything trying. I'd been recruited straight out of graduate school, drawn by the challenge of solving impossible problems and the promise of being part of something revolutionary. The work had consumed me completely. 18-hour days spent debugging algorithms, weekends lost to inspired coding sessions, a social life that consisted entirely of conversations with other engineers about compression ratios and processing speeds. Maria used to joke that she was married to both me and my laptop, that she had to schedule romantic dinners around my latest breakthrough or debugging crisis. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I stood, being mocked for my blue-collar appearance in front of the man whose company I'd single-handedly rescued from financial ruin. My breakthrough algorithm for data compression had been worth millions, had revolutionized their entire platform, and launched them from a struggling startup into the tech giant they were today. The algorithm that now powered half the internet's video streaming capabilities, that made it possible for people to watch movies on their phones and have crystal-clear video calls with people on the other side of the world. James had offered me the position of Chief Technology Officer, a corner office on the top floor, with windows overlooking the entire city, stock options that would have made me wealthy beyond my wildest dreams, and a salary that would have solved every financial worry I'd ever had. He'd painted a picture of a future where I'd be recognized as one of the pioneering minds of the digital age, where my name would be mentioned alongside the great innovators of technology history. But Jessica had been only 5 then, still waking up crying for her mother in the middle of the night, still needing her father to help with homework and pack her lunches and read bedtime stories and simply be present in all the ways that mattered. Maria had been gone for barely 6 months, taken by cancer that had ravaged her body despite every treatment we could afford, every experimental therapy I could research, every prayer I could offer to a God who seemed determined to test my faith. I remember the night Maria died, holding her hand in the hospital as machines beeped their mechanical lullabies around us. She'd made me promise to put Jessica first, always, no matter what opportunities came my way. "She's going to need you more than any job ever will," Maria had whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the ventilator. "Promise me you'll be there for every scraped knee, every homework assignment, every heartbreak. Promise me you'll choose her." The choice had been simple, even if it had torn my heart in two. I'd walked away from the corner office and chosen the corner of Jessica's bedroom, where I'd sit reading bedtime stories until she fell asleep. traded the stock options for soccer practice carpools and parent-teacher conferences, exchanged the promise of financial security for the certainty that my daughter would never feel abandoned the way I had as a child, bouncing between relatives who saw me as a burden after my own parents died in a car accident when I was 7. The sacrifice had been total, absolute. I'd sold my car and bought a beat-up truck suitable for hauling tools and equipment. Moved from our comfortable suburban home to a series of increasingly smaller apartments as my savings dwindled and the reality of single parenthood on a handyman's income set in. I'd learned plumbing and electrical work from YouTube videos and library books, building a business one $20 repair at a time while Jessica slept in the next room, always conscious of keeping the noise down so I wouldn't wake her. I'd given up colleagues who spoke my language of algorithms and data structures, professional conferences where I could discuss the cutting edge of technology with people who understood the thrill of solving complex problems. Given up dating, social life, any hope of remarriage, every moment, every dollar, every ounce of energy devoted to making sure Jessica never felt the loss of her mother in any practical way, that she would have everything she needed even if we couldn't afford everything she wanted. Those first years were brutal. I remember lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling of our tiny one-bedroom apartment, listening to Jessica breathe in the bed we shared because I couldn't afford a 2-bedroom place, wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. The engineering world moves fast, and every month away from it meant falling further behind, watching my skills become obsolete while I learned to fix garbage disposals and unclog bathtub drains. I remember the night Jessica came home from middle school, her face blotchy from crying because some classmate had made fun of her discount store shoes and second-hand backpack. She'd asked me why we couldn't have nice things like other families, why I couldn't get a real job like other dads, why we always had to worry about money when other kids never seemed to think about it at all. I'd held her while she sobbed, my own tears falling silently into her hair, wondering if my pride in providing for her through honest work was worth the cost of her social humiliation. The next morning, I'd picked up my toolbox and knocked on Mrs. Wilson's door, offering to fix her leaky faucet for $20 because that's what I had to charge to keep the lights on. That 20 became 40, then 60, and slowly, painfully, I built a small handyman business that kept us afloat. I learned to take pride in work that others looked down on, learned to find satisfaction in solving problems and helping people, even if those problems involved clogged toilets instead of complex algorithms. Derek's voice brought me crashing back to the present, his words slicing through my memories like a knife through tissue paper. "Look, Mr. Harrison, I don't know what kind of game you're playing here, but facts are facts. The man's a plumber. My wife deserves better than having to introduce her father as someone who works with his hands." His chin jutted forward, but a muscle in his jaw jumped like a live wire, betraying the nervousness he was trying so hard to hide. The platinum cufflinks at his wrists caught the light as he gestured dismissively in my direction, each gesture designed to minimize my worth, to reduce 15 years of sacrifice and love to nothing more than a failure to achieve what he considered success. Jessica's shoulders had drawn up toward her ears, her entire body contracted like she wanted to disappear into her wedding dress. She wouldn't meet my eyes, studying the intricate beadwork on her bodice instead, as if the tiny pearls and crystals held secrets that could save her from this moment. Her new diamond wedding band caught the chandelier light, throwing tiny rainbows across the white fabric of her gown. I'd saved for 8 months to buy her the modest pearl earrings she wore, the same ones Maria had worn on our wedding day, the only piece of jewelry I'd been able to afford then, and one of the few tangible connections Jessica had to the mother she barely remembered. "Your wife," James repeated slowly, each word deliberate as a surgeon's incision, "deserves to know exactly who her father really is." His gaze shifted to me, and I watched his expression transform completely, the sharp lines around his eyes softening as 15 years melted away, and he saw not the handyman in a second-hand suit, but the brilliant engineer who had once saved his company. He straightened almost imperceptibly, the way a man does when he realizes he's in the presence of someone whose worth transcends appearances, someone whose sacrifice he had witnessed firsthand. The moment stretched between us like a bridge, spanning 15 years of silence. 15 years during which I'd wondered if I'd made the right choice, if the cost of being present for Jessica had been worth sacrificing the career. James straightened his jacket with the deliberate precision of a man preparing for battle, his movements sharp and controlled. The conversations around us had died to whispers, creating an invisible circle of anticipation that seemed to pulse with its own energy. I could see other wedding guests beginning to drift toward our corner of the ballroom, drawn by the magnetic pull of drama unfolding, their champagne glasses forgotten as they sensed something significant was about to happen. Derek's confident smirk began to waver at the edges, like watercolor running in the rain, as something in James's demeanor shifted from polite tolerance to something far more dangerous. The change was subtle but unmistakable. The way his shoulders squared, the way his voice took on the commanding tone. "Brandon Stevens," James said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet corner of the ballroom with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding rooms full of powerful people. The way he said my name was different from how Derek had sneered at it. There was weight to it, respect, as if he was announcing the presence of someone important rather than dismissing someone insignificant. "Tell me, do you still remember the Fibonacci sequence optimization you developed for real-time data compression? The algorithm that could compress video data at a rate 30% faster than anything else on the market at the time?" The words hit the air like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples of confusion across Derek's face and through the growing crowd of onlookers. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again, a fish gasping for air it couldn't find. Around us, the gathered crowd leaned in closer, sensing that something significant was happening, but not yet understanding what they were witnessing. I could see phones beginning to appear in hands, people recognizing that whatever was unfolding here was worth capturing. My throat constricted as memories flooded back. The algorithm that had consumed my nights for months, the breakthrough that had come to me at 3 in the morning while Jessica slept peacefully in her crib. I'd been surviving on coffee and determination, scribbling equations on napkins when inspiration struck, building something that would revolutionize how data moved through the internet. The nights I'd spent hunched over my laptop, debugging code while baby Jessica slept in the next room, the moment of pure triumph when the compression rates finally hit the targets that everyone said were impossible. "I remember," I said quietly, my voice barely audible above the string quartet that continued playing, oblivious to the drama unfolding beneath the crystal chandelier. But my words seemed to carry across the space like thunder, and I saw several people in the crowd exchange glances, beginning to realize that this conversation was heading somewhere none of them had expected. Derek's champagne glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the marble floor in a spray of crystal and golden liquid. The sound echoed through our corner of the ballroom like a gunshot, and several nearby guests turned to stare, their elegant conversations forgotten as they sensed something significant happening. Derek's face had gone the color of old parchment, and a thin line of sweat appeared along his upper lip despite the perfectly controlled climate of the ballroom. The crash of breaking glass seemed to snap something into focus for James. His expression hardened with the determination of a man who had waited 15 years to set the record straight, who had watched from afar as the most talented engineer he'd ever known disappeared into obscurity because of a choice that should have been celebrated, not hidden. What are you talking about?" Derek stammered, his polished corporate voice cracking like a teenager going through puberty. His hands moved restlessly, adjusting his tie, smoothing his hair, fidgeting with his cufflinks as if the expensive accessories could somehow restore his confidence and authority. Jessica's grip on her bouquet tightened until her knuckles showed white against the green stems, and I could see her trying to process what was happening, trying to understand why her wedding reception had suddenly become something she didn't recognize. James turned to address the small crowd that had begun to gather, drawn by the magnetic pull of unfolding drama like moths to a flame. Wedding guests who had been enjoying champagne and small talk now found themselves witnessing something that would be discussed in boardrooms and social circles for months to come. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding boardrooms full of executives and investors, "I'd like you to meet one of the most brilliant engineers I've ever had the privilege to work with. Brandon Stevens developed the core technology that built Teknova Solutions into what it is today." The words landed like physical blows on Derek's chest, and I could see him struggling to process what he was hearing. He stumbled backward half a step, his Italian leather shoes squeaking against the polished floor. His breathing had become shallow and rapid, the kind of hyperventilation that preceded either flight or complete collapse. The crowd around us had grown larger now, and I could see phones appearing more openly. That's impossible," Derek whispered, but his voice carried no conviction, only the desperate hope of a drowning man reaching for a rope that wasn't there. His perfectly styled hair had begun to stick to his forehead with sweat, and his expensive suit jacket hung loose on his suddenly diminished frame. Jessica's bouquet dropped from her nerveless fingers, white roses scattering across the marble like fallen snow. Her mouth had formed a perfect circle of shock, her dark eyes wide and unblinking as she stared at me as if seeing a stranger wearing her father's face. The pearl earrings, Maria's earrings, caught the light as her head moved slowly from side to side in denial, as if she could somehow make this moment unhappen by refusing to believe it. "Brandon," James continued, his gaze finding mine across the circle of stunned faces, "was offered the position of Chief Technology Officer 15 years ago. Stock options, corner office, salary that would have made him a millionaire within 5 years. He turned it down." The simple statement hung in the air like a challenge, daring anyone to question the magnitude of what those words meant. Around us, I could hear the sharp intake of breath from the gathering crowd, the whispered, "Oh my God," from someone's lips, the rustling of fabric as people shifted to get a better view of the man who had just been revealed to be something entirely different from what they'd assumed. Derek's legs seemed to give out slightly, and he caught himself against a nearby table, his knuckles white against the white linen tablecloth. The confident, condescending man who had called me a deadbeat only minutes before was dissolving before our eyes, melting like snow in summer heat. His platinum watch caught the light as his hand shook, the expensive timepiece now seeming more like a child's toy than a symbol of success and status. The crowd around us had grown to nearly 20 people now, all of them watching with the fascination of people witnessing a car accident, unable to look away from Derek's public humiliation. I could see his colleagues from the company, people who had undoubtedly heard his stories about his wife's embarrassing father, watching him with expressions ranging from shock to barely concealed satisfaction at seeing the office bully get his comeuppance. The silence stretched like a taut wire ready to snap, electric with anticipation and the weight of unspoken truths. James's eyes found mine again, and in them I saw the question he was about to ask, the one that would either destroy what remained of my relationship with Jessica or finally make her understand the depth of my love and the magnitude of the choices I'd made for her sake. My chest rose and fell in slow, measured breaths as I prepared for the moment that would change everything, the moment when 15 years of carefully constructed silence would finally be broken. Around us, the crowd had grown to nearly 40 people now, a sea of faces turned toward our small drama, like flowers following the sun. I could see Derek's colleagues from Teknova, people who had undoubtedly heard his stories about his wife's embarrassing father, watching with expressions that ranged from shock to fascination. Wedding guests who had come expecting nothing more dramatic than toasts and dancing found themselves witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. The ballroom had taken on an almost theatrical quality, with the crystal chandelier casting dramatic shadows and the string quartet providing an incongruously elegant soundtrack to Derek's very public downfall. Even the servers had stopped their circulation, standing at the edges of the gathering crowd with trays of untouched champagne, unwilling to interrupt what was clearly a moment of historical significance. "The question everyone's wondering," James said, his voice cutting through the hushed ballroom like a blade through silk, "is why a brilliant engineer would turn down a seven-figure salary and stock options that would have made him wealthy beyond most people's wildest dreams." His pause stretched long enough for Derek to attempt one last desperate rally, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a fish dying on dry land. Derek's face had gone from pale to gray, the color of old concrete, and sweat beaded along his hairline and ran down his temples like tears. His breathing came in short, sharp gasps that fogged his designer glasses, and I could see his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the table behind him like a lifeline. The confident, condescending man who had called me a deadbeat was dissolving before our eyes, his carefully constructed persona crumbling like a house of cards in a hurricane. I could see the wheels turning in James's mind, the careful calculation of a CEO who understood the power of perfect timing. He'd built his career on knowing when to strike, when to reveal the crucial piece of information that would shift the entire dynamic of a negotiation or a confrontation. This moment had been 15 years in the making, and he was going to make it count. "I'll tell you why," James continued, his gaze never leaving my face, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Because 3 days after I made the offer, Brandon's wife Maria passed away from cancer. He had a 5-year-old daughter who needed him more than any company ever could. He chose her over everything else, over money, over career advancement, over his own future, because that's what real fathers do." The words fell like hammer blows on anvil steel, each one reverberating through the ballroom with the force of absolute truth. Around us, I heard the collective intake of breath from the gathered crowd, saw hands move to cover hearts, watched eyes fill with sudden understanding as the magnitude of what they were witnessing became clear. This wasn't just a public humiliation, this was a revelation of the kind of love that most people only read about in books or see in movies. Several women in the crowd had begun to cry, their carefully applied makeup running as they processed the enormity of the sacrifice they were hearing about. Men who had spent their entire careers climbing corporate ladders found themselves questioning what success really meant. The story was spreading through the crowd in whispers, guests who had missed the beginning getting caught up by those who had witnessed the entire confrontation. Jessica's legs buckled, and she caught herself against a nearby chair, her wedding dress pooling around her like spilled cream. The color drained from her face so completely that her lipstick looked like a wound against pale skin, and her dark eyes filled with tears. "Dad?" The word came out broken, barely a whisper, carrying 15 years of misunderstanding in its fractured syllables. Derek made a sound like air escaping from a punctured tire, a wheeze of desperation and disbelief. His perfectly styled hair had begun to stick to his forehead with sweat, and his expensive suit jacket hung loose on his suddenly diminished frame. "No," he said, shaking his head frantically, his voice rising to a pitch that bordered on hysteria. "No, that's not. He's just a plumber. He fixes toilets. He's nobody. He's nothing." The desperation in Derek's voice was palpable now, the sound of a man watching his entire worldview collapse in real time. Everything he'd built his identity on, the belief that success was measured in dollars, that intelligence was proven by corner offices, that worth was determined by social status, was crumbling beneath the weight of a truth he couldn't refute. "Nobody?" James's voice rose for the first time, carrying an edge of steel that made several guests step back involuntarily. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as the full force of his anger became apparent. His usual corporate composure had given way to something more primal, more personal. This man sacrificed a fortune to raise his daughter alone. He chose bedtime stories over board meetings. He chose soccer practices over stock options. He chose love over money, sacrifice over success, being present over being wealthy. Each sentence hit Derek like a physical blow, driving him further back until he bumped against the wall, trapped with nowhere to retreat. The gathered crowd had grown to nearly 50 people now, drawn by the magnetic pull of witnessing someone's carefully constructed world crumble in real time. I could see phones appearing more openly now, people recognizing that they were witnessing something that would be replayed and dissected across social media for months to come. Derek's boss was publicly destroying him, and everyone knew it. His platinum watch caught the light as his hands trembled, the expensive timepiece now seeming more like evidence of his shallow values than any symbol of success. "And you," James turned to Derek with the precision of a surgeon making an incision, "called this man a deadbeat. You mocked someone who gave up millions of dollars to be the father his daughter needed. You insulted someone who's worth more in character than you'll ever be worth in salary." Derek's face had gone from gray to green, and I thought for a moment he might actually be sick right there on the marble floor. "I've been looking for a reason to terminate your employment, Derek," James continued, his voice now carrying the cold finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Your performance reviews have been mediocre at best. Your attitude toward colleagues has been consistently arrogant and dismissive. I've been tolerant, hoping that perhaps marrying into Brandon's family might teach you something about real values, about what actual worth looks like. But tonight, watching you mock the man whose daughter you're marrying, I realize I was wrong to give you any more chances." Derek's knees visibly shook, and he pressed his back harder against the wall as if trying to disappear into the wallpaper. Around us, the circle of witnesses had grown even larger, and I could see Derek's colleagues from Technova watching with expressions that ranged from shock to barely concealed satisfaction. The office bully was getting his comeuppance, and everyone was here to see it. Jessica's sobs had begun in earnest now, her shoulders shaking. She looked at me through her tears, and I saw the 5-year-old girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who needed her father to chase away the monsters in her closet and promise her that everything would be all right. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the words tumbling out between sobs that seemed to come from the very depths of her soul. "I'm so sorry, Dad. I didn't know. I never knew what you gave up for me. I've been so ashamed of you, and you're the most amazing father anyone could ask for." The room had gone completely silent except for the soft sound of Jessica's crying and Derek's labored breathing. Even the string quartet had stopped playing, the musicians sensing that something momentous was unfolding and that their music would be an intrusion on this moment of raw truth. James reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a business card, holding it out to me with steady fingers that commanded respect. "Brandon," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 15 years of regret and admiration. "The CTO position is still open if you're interested. We've never found anyone who could fill your shoes, and frankly, I don't think we ever will. The offer stands. Same terms, adjusted for inflation, and then some. You built the foundation that our entire company stands on, and it's time you got the recognition you deserve." The business card hung in the air between us like a bridge to a future I'd thought was lost forever, a second chance at the life I'd walked away from so long ago. But as I looked at Jessica's tear-stained face, saw the dawning understanding and love in her eyes, I knew that no corner office could ever compare to this moment of connection with my daughter. I took the business card with fingers that barely trembled, the embossed logo of Technova Solutions feeling familiar beneath my calloused fingertips, like an old friend returning after a long absence. The weight of it, such a small piece of paper that represented everything I'd walked away from 15 years ago, seemed impossible to measure. Around us, the crowd had begun to disperse slowly, conversations resuming in hushed tones as guests processed what they'd witnessed, sharing the story in urgent whispers that would spread through social media within hours. Jessica moved toward me with uncertain steps, her wedding dress rustling like autumn leaves with each movement. Mascara had left dark trails down her cheeks, creating abstract patterns of grief and recognition across her pale skin, and her carefully styled hair had begun to come loose from its elegant updo, making her look younger, more vulnerable. She looked like the little girl who used to run to me when she'd scraped her knee or had a nightmare, The child who had once believed her father could fix anything in the world with nothing more than love and determination. The transformation in the room was palpable. Guests who had looked at me with polite dismissal an hour ago now watched with something approaching awe, their expressions shifting as they processed the magnitude of what they'd witnessed. I could hear fragments of conversations. "Can you believe? All this time. That poor man." As people began to understand the true story behind the modest figure in the second-hand suit. "Dad," she whispered, her voice raw from tears and thick with emotion she'd held back for too long, words that seemed to carry the weight of 15 years of misunderstanding. "I failed you. I failed you as a daughter, and I don't know how to make it right. How do I apologize for being ashamed of the most selfless man I've ever known?" My arms opened without conscious thought, the same way they had 1,000 times before when she'd needed comfort, when the world had seemed too big and scary for a little girl to handle alone. She fell against my chest, her sobs muffled against my second-hand jacket, and I felt her wedding tiara slip sideways as I stroked her hair the same way I had when she was 5 and afraid of the monsters under her bed. "You didn't fail me, sweetheart," I murmured, my own voice thick with emotion I'd held back for too long, years of hurt and love and fierce pride all tangled together. "You never could. You were trying to build a life, trying to fit into a world that told you success looked a certain way. I understand why you felt ashamed. I was ashamed too, sometimes, when I looked around at the other parents in their nice clothes and expensive cars. The crowd around us had thinned considerably, but those who remained watched with the reverence usually reserved for sacred moments. Mrs. Henderson from down the street, who had hired me to fix her kitchen sink just last month, caught my eye and nodded with what looked like newfound respect. Mr. Torres, whose garbage disposal I'd repaired 2 weeks ago, raised his champagne glass in a small salute that made my chest tighten with unexpected warmth. Derek had slumped against the wall like a marionette with cut strings, his expensive suit wrinkled now, his perfect appearance as disheveled as his shattered confidence. He watched Jessica in my arms with the hollow-eyed expression of a man realizing he'd lost something precious through his own arrogance and cruelty. The platinum watch that had seemed so important an hour ago now looked garish and meaningless on his wrist. James approached Derek with the measured steps of an executioner, holding an envelope that Derek accepted with shaking hands. The paper rustled as Derek's trembling fingers tried to grip it, and I could see him struggling to read the words through eyes that were probably blurred with panic and disbelief. "Your termination paperwork will be on your desk Monday morning," James said quietly, his voice carrying no satisfaction, only the weight of necessary justice. "I suggest you use the weekend to update your resume and perhaps reflect on what truly matters in life. And Derek?" He paused until Derek's bloodshot eyes met his, forcing the younger man to look him in the face. "Next time you meet someone who works with their hands, remember that they might be working with their heart too." Jessica pulled back enough to look at me, her dark eyes still swimming with tears but clearer now, like storm clouds beginning to part after a violent thunderstorm. "All those years," she said, her voice breaking on the words like glass under pressure, "I was ashamed of you. I was ashamed of the most loving, most selfless father any girl could ask for." Her hands found my face, her fingers tracing the lines that 15 years of worry and sacrifice had etched there, reading them like a map of love she'd never learned to navigate. "How do you forgive someone for that? How do you forgive someone for being so blind? So ungrateful?" The questions tumbled out of her like water through a broken dam, and I could see the guilt threatening to drown her in its depth. I covered her hands with mine, feeling the smooth gold of her wedding band against my palm, still warm from her touch. "The same way you forgive someone for loving you too much to let you see them struggle," I said softly, my voice carrying the weight of every sleepless night I'd spent worrying about her future, every sacrifice I'd made gladly. "The same way you forgive someone for choosing your happiness over their own pride, for believing that being present was more important than being impressive." Through the tall windows of the ballroom, I could see the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk, each one a small beacon of hope in the darkness. The business card in my pocket felt warm against my chest, a bridge between the life I'd chosen and the one I'd left behind. But as I looked at Jessica's face, saw the love and understanding finally reflected there, I knew that no corner office could ever compare to this moment. "I love you, Dad," she whispered, the words carrying the weight of 15 years of unspoken gratitude, of childhood memories she'd pushed aside in her rush to become someone she thought the world would respect. "I love you for every sacrifice, every choice, every moment you put me first, when you could have put yourself first instead." Her tears had stopped falling, but her eyes remained bright with them, like dewdrops caught in morning sunlight. The ballroom around us had faded away, leaving only this perfect moment of understanding between a father and daughter who had finally found their way back to each other's hearts. The orchestra had resumed playing, but their music seemed different now, softer and more meaningful, a soundtrack to reconciliation rather than celebration. 3 months later, I found myself standing in the sleek glass elevator of Technova Solutions, watching the city shrink below me as I rose to the 42nd floor for the first time in 15 years. The CTO nameplate on my office door still felt surreal, like something from someone else's life. But the algorithm work came back to me like muscle memory, my fingers finding their rhythm on the keyboard as if no time had passed at all. Jessica visited the office frequently now, bringing lunch or simply stopping by to see where her father worked, to understand the world I'd left behind for her sake. The pride in her eyes when she introduced me to her friends as my dad, the chief technology officer, was worth more than any salary increase. She'd started asking about my work, really listening when I explained the intricacies of data compression and artificial intelligence, engaging with a part of my life she'd never shown interest in before. The divorce papers had come through quickly once Derek's true nature had been revealed so publicly. He was working at a much smaller firm now, for a fraction of his previous salary, and from what I heard through the industry grapevine, his arrogance had been considerably tempered by the harsh reality of professional consequences. But it wasn't Derek's downfall that occupied my thoughts during those autumn months of transition. It was the slow, careful process of rebuilding my relationship with Jessica, of learning how to be her father in this new context where we were both adults who had learned some hard truths about love and sacrifice. If you enjoyed this story of love, sacrifice, and redemption, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming tales. Share what time it is where you are and tell me about a moment when understanding changed everything for you. Thank you for joining me on this emotional journey. And remember that sometimes the greatest victories are measured not in money or status, but in the love we give and receive.